Thomas Hale had been a ranger in Yosemite National Park for nearly a decade. At 36, he carried himself with the calm authority of someone who knew the backcountry as well as his own home. Colleagues respected him for his steadiness, never reckless, never complacent, always methodical. On the evening of July 14th, he signed out for a routine patrol along a stretch of trail that wound through granite ridges and stands of towering pines. It wasn't unusual for him to go alone. The patrol was standard. Check trail markers, ensure no campers had strayed off designated sites, and confirm that no hikers were left wandering after sunset. Weather conditions were good. The sky was clear, the air still warmed from the day's heat, and daylight lingered long into the evening. Hale carried his standard kit, radio clipped to his vest, flashlight strapped to his belt, extra batteries in his pack. At 7:12 p.m., he checked in with dispatch. His voice came across the radio calm, professional. Trail markers intact, area looks clear. Continuing another mile before I loop back. It sounded routine, exactly the sort of update rangers made countless times a year. No urgency, no strain. No one imagined it would be the last ordinary report he ever gave. At 7:58 p.m., dispatch expected Hale's second check-in. Instead, what came through was a brief, clipped transmission. "I see someone out here." The words were steady, but quieter than usual, as though he was speaking while moving. Then static swallowed the signal. Dispatch called back immediately. "Unit 7, confirm. Do you have contact with a hiker?" No reply. They tried again, 5, 10, 15 times. Each call returned only a wash of static. Protocol required them to wait a short interval. Sometimes radios cut out in valleys, signals bouncing poorly between granite walls. But as the minutes stretched into an hour with no further communication, concern grew. By 9 p.m., rangers mobilized from the station. A pair drove toward the trailhead where Hale's vehicle was parked. His truck sat neatly in its spot, keys gone, nothing unusual inside. The officers assumed he had come across a lost hiker. Encounters like that were common. Rangers often guided disoriented backpackers back to trailheads. But the absence of a follow-up transmission gnawed at them. Hale was diligent. He would never leave dispatch hanging, never let a situation unfold without at least a brief update. At 10:15 p.m., the search expanded. Teams swept the first 2 miles of trail with spotlights, calling Hale's name. They found nothing. No hikers. No flash of a ranger's reflective vest. No sound of boots on stone. Back at the station, the dispatcher replayed his last words over and over. The tone wasn't panicked, just factual, almost puzzled. "I see someone out here." Who he saw or thought he saw remains the question that would haunt the search for weeks. By dawn the next morning, more than a dozen rangers, volunteers, and dogs converged on the trail. They began at Hale's truck and worked their way in. The first mile yielded nothing unusual. Boot prints matching his size, steady stride, no signs of struggle. About 3 miles in, his trail stopped at a clearing. The ground there was soft, dusted with pine needles, perfect for tracking, but the prints simply ended. Dogs circled, noses down, then whined and sat. The clearing held something stranger still. Small stacks of stones, cairns, had been arranged around its perimeter. Each was no taller than a foot. 5 or 6 rocks balanced carefully atop one another. The formations weren't official markers, and rangers who knew the trail swore they hadn't been there before. At the center of the clearing lay nothing. No pack, no radio, no flashlight. Just silence and the faint smell of pine resin drifting on still air. Searchers fanned out in every direction. Helicopters buzzed overhead, sweeping the valley with infrared. No heat signature turned up. Divers checked nearby streams. Climbers rappelled down granite faces in case of a fall. Every possible hazard was examined, every crevice searched. Nothing. The cairns remained the detail no one could explain. Some suggested Hale himself had built them, perhaps as a signal, but their number and placement didn't match his usual field methods. Others dismissed them as coincidence, left by hikers long before. But the dog's refusal to track beyond that point unsettled everyone. It was as if Ranger Thomas Hale had walked into the clearing, reported seeing someone, and then ceased to exist. For weeks, the search continued. Dozens of rangers, volunteers, even members of Hale's family combed the valley, but no new evidence surfaced. His radio was never found. His flashlight, spare batteries, even his service knife, all missing. It was as though he had stepped into the clearing and simply never walked out. Around campfires and in hushed conversations at ranger stations, theories spread. Some believed he had stumbled upon something, someone he wasn't meant to. Others wondered if exhaustion or sudden illness struck, though no trace supported it. What lingered most were the cairns, rebuilt by unseen hands. The official file listed Thomas Hale as missing, presumed deceased. But among rangers who still patrol that trail, his case remains a quiet warning. Some admit to finding new cairns stacked on the path at dawn, though no one ever admits to building them. And always they remember his last words, "I see someone out here."
The 4 friends had planned this trip for weeks, eager to escape the city and breathe the cold, pine-scented air of the Rockies. The drive had been long, winding through mountain roads that grew narrower and darker the higher they climbed, but spirits stayed high. The campsite they chose lay in a secluded valley, ringed by dense evergreens that shut out much of the sky. To them, it felt perfect, quiet, remote, untouched. They unpacked their gear quickly, laughter echoing as they fumbled with tent poles and compared who had brought the most useless supplies. A cooler full of cheap beer, a bag of marshmallows, and an old guitar soon became the centerpiece of their plans. Ethan, though, seemed different. He smiled at their jokes, but often drifted toward the tree line, staring at the woods as if listening for something. When asked, he shrugged it off, saying he just liked the quiet. The others teased him, calling him the Forest Man as they stacked firewood. At the last gas station, hours before, a clerk had warned them, half serious, half joking, to be careful. People get lost up there, she'd said, handing back their change. Sometimes they don't come back. They had laughed it off at the time, treating it like a ghost story. By nightfall, the tents were up, the fire crackled, and the stars cut sharp against the black sky. The friends leaned back in their camp chairs, heat from the flames warming their faces as the forest loomed silently around them. The fire had burned down to glowing embers when the group finally crawled into their tents. The forest was alive with small noises, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of branches high above. Fatigue from the long hike set in quickly, and one by one they drifted into sleep.
It was some time past midnight when Sarah stirred. A faint crunch outside the tent pulled her from a dream. At first, she thought it was one of the others sneaking out to relieve themselves. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed Ethan's sleeping bag was unzipped and empty. She whispered his name, hoping he'd answer from just outside. Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps moving away. She unzipped the tent and peeked into the clearing. The moon had slipped behind clouds, leaving only vague outlines of trees and the dying glow of the fire. Waking the others, panic spread quickly as they realized Ethan was gone. They grabbed flashlights and fanned out around the camp, calling his name into the dark. At first, the beams of light revealed only undergrowth and trunks, until someone found them, boot prints pressed into the damp earth, heading straight into the forest. They followed, hearts pounding, until the trail simply stopped. The prints ended in the middle of a patch of needles and moss, as if Ethan had taken one last step and vanished. They swept their lights in widening circles, searching for more impressions, but there were none. Then came the voice, faint, carried on the wind, so distant they could barely tell which direction it came from. "Sarah, here!" It was Ethan, or at least it sounded like him. The group froze, torn between relief and unease. The voice didn't sound quite right, stretched thin, echoing in a way that made the hairs on their necks rise. They called back, shouting for him to come toward the light, but the woods swallowed their words. Again, faint and hollow. "Here!" They stood in silence, flashlights trembling in their hands, every instinct screaming that something about the call was wrong.
At first light, the group reported Ethan's disappearance to the nearest ranger station. By mid-morning, a search team assembled. Dogs, trackers, and volunteers spreading out across the valley. The friends clung together, hollow-eyed from a sleepless night, each replaying those eerie calls in their head. The rangers studied the tracks with furrowed brows. Ethan's footprints led steadily into the forest and then stopped, clean and sudden, like someone had plucked him off the ground. No signs of a fall, no drag marks, no scuffle, just an end. "They don't just stop like this," one ranger muttered, crouching low. "Not unless he was carried." But there were no other prints. As the search widened, stranger details surfaced. Several branches high above their reach were snapped clean, broken as if something heavy had moved through the canopy. At night, the forest grew restless. Those who stayed behind at camp swore they heard whistling carried through the trees, never close, never far, like something circling them in the dark. Sarah couldn't shake the memory of that hollow voice calling her name. Once, while following the search team along a ridge, she heard it again, faint, threading through the wind. She stopped in her tracks, staring down the slope where shadows pooled thick between trees. "Did you hear that?" she asked, but the ranger beside her shook his head. The longer the search went on, the more the friends argued. One insisted Ethan had gotten lost and was calling for help. Another swore what they'd heard wasn't him at all. Fear and exhaustion wore them thin, and each night seemed heavier than the last.
On the third evening, a volunteer reported seeing movement just beyond the tree line at dusk. A figure standing still, half hidden, watching. By the time anyone reached the spot, it was gone. The ground showed no fresh prints. The forest seemed to absorb every effort, every shout, every plea. The friends began to wonder if they should have listened to the gas station clerk's warning. After 5 days, the official search wound down. The dogs had picked up nothing. The helicopters found no trace, and the trackers were left with only that abrupt trail footprints ending in silence. The rangers filed Ethan as another missing person. The case marked unresolved. His friends left the mountains hollow, the valley behind them pressing on their memories like a weight. The laughter around the fire, the teasing, the casual shrug of his shoulders, all of it replayed endlessly, tainted now by the question of what had taken him. Locals whispered it wasn't the first time. Other hikers, campers, and hunters had gone missing in the same valley. Their stories passed around in low tones, warnings disguised as folklore. The forest there was said to keep what it wanted. Weeks later, Sarah was driving alone past the trailhead at dusk when she rolled her window down. The air was cool, the sky sinking to black, and just as she passed the faded wooden sign, a voice threaded faintly through the pines. "Sarah, here."
Her hands tightened on the wheel. She didn't stop. She didn't even look. But she drove the rest of the night with the radio off, knowing she would never forget that sound.
The Cascades were no stranger to vanishings. Steep ravines, tangled undergrowth, and sudden storms had a way of swallowing the unprepared. But when Mark, an experienced hiker, disappeared, it felt different. He and 2 friends had set out on a 3-day trek. By the second afternoon, they reached a fork near a river. Mark offered to scout ahead while the others rested. They watched him vanish around the bend with his GPS in hand, promising to be back in 15 minutes. He never returned. At first, they assumed he'd taken longer than planned, maybe stopped to photograph the landscape. But after an hour passed, panic set in. They followed his trail until it broke at the edge of a ravine. Down below, the river roared. On the ground, his boot prints ended at the lip of the slope. Rescue teams arrived the next day, helicopters sweeping the ridges while searchers combed the forest. Mark's belongings began to turn up in impossible places. His backpack wedged in the crook of a tree 20 feet off the ground, his water bottle lying miles from where he'd vanished, his GPS still working but found half buried near a dry creek bed no one remembered crossing. The pattern made no sense. It was as if someone or something had taken pieces of him and scattered them like breadcrumbs. As the search stretched on, the friends admitted something they hadn't told the rangers. The night before Mark vanished, they noticed lights flickering through the trees across the valley. Not campfires, not flashlights, something colder, bluish, moving in deliberate patterns. Later, when they tried to sleep, they swore they heard low voices outside the tent. Locals whispered about feral people living deep in the Cascades, remnants of families who disappeared generations ago. Others said it wasn't people at all, but something older, something that lured hikers away. After weeks, the search ended without a body. Mark's case remains open, his scattered belongings locked away as evidence of nothing conclusive. His friends no longer return to the mountains. Sometimes, when the wind cuts through the trees, they think of those strange lights and the hollow sound of voices that didn't quite sound human. And they wonder if Mark ever made it out of the ravine, or if he's still out there, wandering in the Cascades, guided by something that wanted him all along.
Daniel adjusted the straps of his pack as he stepped onto the Appalachian Trail, boots crunching against damp leaves. The morning mist clung low, winding like smoke between the ridges. His younger brother, Michael, was already a few paces ahead, whistling off-key, the brim of his ball cap dripping with condensation. This was their ritual. 1 week every year, just the two of them. No phones, no work, no distractions. Daniel, the older by 3 years, was steady and deliberate, the kind of hiker who double-checked maps and carried spare batteries for the headlamp. Michael had the opposite temperament, reckless, fearless, always taking side paths just to see what was there. The Appalachian Trail in early autumn was a living thing. The trees burned with color, russet, gold, scarlet, while the air was sharp with the smell of pine and wet soil. But beauty carried weight here. The fog could roll in and reduce visibility to a few yards, and trails twisted across miles of wilderness where the unprepared could vanish. That thought came back to Daniel later that morning at a diner just off the highway before they set out. A waitress pouring coffee had glanced at their boots and packs, then asked where they were headed. When Daniel mentioned their chosen section of the trail, her hand paused mid-pour. "Be careful out there," she said softly. "People go missing on that stretch. Hikers say they see things in the trees. They call them watchers." Michael laughed, brushing it off as mountain folklore. Daniel forced a smile, but felt the words sink deep, threading into his nerves. By the time they left the diner, clouds were stacking high above the ridges, gray and heavy, promising rain. Neither brother knew then that this hike would end unlike any of the others, that only one of them would walk back out.
The first 2 days passed in a rhythm both brothers knew well. Long stretches of trail broken by water breaks, the slap of boots in mud, the hiss of stoves at night. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of rain-soaked leaves. At camp, they strung a tarp between trees and boiled noodles, steam curling up into the darkness. Yet Daniel couldn't shake a gnawing unease. On their second evening, as they cooked by the fire, he caught movement in his periphery, just past the glow of the flames. A figure? A shadow? It was gone when he turned. Later, while gathering firewood, he felt eyes on him. The forest was still, too still. He returned to camp quickly, hiding his nerves behind a forced grin. That night, while Michael snored, Daniel lay awake, listening. Branches snapped softly in the distance, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps moving in a slow circle around their camp. He held his breath. The noises stopped the instant he reached for his flashlight. In the morning, Michael dismissed it. "Probably deer. You always overthink, man." He grinned, shouldering his pack. "That's why you're the planner, and I'm the fun one." But the next day, Daniel spotted something undeniable. Half a mile up the trail, through drifting fog, he saw a shape. Human, tall, standing utterly still between two trees. For a moment, he thought it might be another hiker, but the figure never moved, never shifted its weight, never even adjusted its pack. He blinked, and the fog thickened. When it cleared seconds later, the space between the trees was empty. Daniel stopped, heart hammering. "Mike, did you see—" "What?" Michael's voice was easy, unconcerned. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing, just thought I saw someone." He tried to laugh it off, but the unease spread. Every time the wind rustled the branches, he imagined something just behind them, matching their pace, watching.
That night, the disturbances returned. Their food bag, tied up in a tree, had been torn open. Their tent lines sagged as if someone had tripped over them. And when Daniel swore he heard footsteps again, Michael finally admitted in a whisper, "Okay, maybe you're not crazy." But by then, it was too late. The storm arrived suddenly, like the sky had been waiting to collapse. By midday, clouds cracked open, spilling sheets of rain across the trail. The forest darkened, leaves whipping in the wind, water rushing in sudden rivulets along the path. Daniel and Michael pulled ponchos from their packs, but the rain soaked them through anyway. The trail turned slick, mud sucking at their boots. Their breaths came fast, the air sharp and cold. "Let's make it over this ridge," Daniel shouted over the roar. "Then we'll stop." Michael nodded, falling a little behind as he fiddled with the strap of his pack. Daniel kept climbing, each step heavier than the last, until he realized He could no longer hear his brother's footsteps behind him. He turned, blinking rain from his eyes. Mike? Silence, except for the pounding of rain. Then, a shout. Michael's voice, distant, sharp with panic. Dan! Daniel scrambled back down the ridge, boots slipping in mud, heart slamming. The trail curved, but when he reached the bend, there was no one there. Just the churn of water streaming downhill. He searched frantically, calling Michael's name. Finally, he spotted it, a partial boot print pressed deep into the mud, sliding toward the edge of the slope. Beyond it, nothing. No more prints, no broken branches, no sign of a fall. Dan, his voice cracked. For a moment, the rain softened. Through the trees, carried faintly on the wind, he heard his brother answer. Dan, here! He froze, listening. The voice was warped, stretched thin as if it were both close and impossibly far away. He spun, shining his flashlight despite the daylight, beams cutting through sheets of rain. Nothing but trees and fog.
Hours blurred together. Daniel retraced every step, shouted until his throat burned, circled wider and wider, the storm drenching him until his pack felt like stone. He slipped more than once, nearly tumbling down hidden ravines, but pushed on, convinced he'd see Michael emerge around the next bend. But the forest gave him nothing. By nightfall, Daniel stumbled onto the trail again, shivering, exhausted, and very much alone. By dawn, Daniel staggered into a ranger station at the base of the trail. His clothes clung damp to his skin, lips blue, eyes wild with panic. He spilled out the story in broken bursts, his brother's shout, the footprint, the voice through the storm. The rangers acted quickly. Within hours, search teams spread along the ridgeline. Dogs sniffed the mud, helicopters skimmed the valleys, volunteers combed every slope. For 3 days, the mountains echoed with calls of "Michael! Michael!" But not a single sign appeared beyond that last partial footprint. Theories ran in circles. Some believed Michael had slipped into a hidden ravine, swept away by storm runoff. Others thought he had wandered off trail, disoriented, and succumbed to exposure. But there were no broken branches, no scent trail for the dogs, no dropped gear. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Daniel couldn't let go of what he had seen and heard. On the morning of the disappearance, that tall figure in the fog, still and silent, and the voice, Michael's voice, yet not, calling from nowhere. He told the rangers, but they exchanged uneasy glances, jotting notes without comment. Word spread quickly among locals. Some muttered about the Watchers of the Trail, stories that had floated for generations, hikers who vanished mid-step, tents left zipped and empty, voices calling from the trees long after the missing were gone. The search wound down after a week. Daniel returned home without his brother, carrying only unanswered questions. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that fog, that footprint cut short, and the shadows between trees that seemed far too patient. Months later, Daniel still woke in the night, drenched in sweat, the echo of his brother's shout ringing in his ears.
He avoided the mountains, yet they haunted him in dreams. The ridgeline slick with rain, the fog curling low, that unmoving figure between the trees. One sleepless evening, guilt pulled him back. He drove to the old trailhead, parking beneath the same warped wooden sign. For a long while, the forest was silent. Then, through the open window, a voice threaded out of the trees. "Dan, here." It was Michael's voice, broken and hollow. Daniel drove away, trembling.
James Whitaker had been hunting Alaska's backcountry for more than a decade. At 43, he was the kind of man people called dependable, steady at work, generous with neighbors, patient with his 2 sons. Hunting was his reprieve. Each fall, he took a week alone in the wilderness, carrying little more than a pack, a rifle, and the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. That September, he drove north from Fairbanks and parked where the dirt road ended. From there, he hiked miles into the brush, his pack heavy with rations, a compass clipped to his belt, and a well-worn journal tucked into a side pocket. Friends recalled him joking before he left. "A week alone with the bears," he said, grinning, "and maybe I'll bring home a rack worth bragging about." The area he entered was remote, stitched with rivers and low ridges, thick spruce forests stretching in every direction. Weather could turn in minutes, and once the mist rolled in, even seasoned hunters risked losing their bearings. But James wasn't reckless. He marked his map carefully, carried backup matches in waterproof tins, and double-checked his gear before setting off. When he didn't return the following week, his absence struck everyone as odd. James was punctual to a fault. If he said he'd be back Sunday, he'd be back Sunday. 2 days later, with no sign of him, the state troopers organized a search party. At the time, no one imagined what they would or wouldn't find months later. According to his journal, James made steady progress those first days. He noted the weather, clear skies, cold mornings, one evening of light rain. He described tracks he'd followed, fresh moose prints near a riverbed, the distant call of loons at dusk. His handwriting was neat, measured, the way it always was when he recorded hunting trips. By the 4th day, the entries shifted. One line read, "Heard movement after dark." Not a bear, too deliberate, two-legged. The following morning he wrote of waking to find branches snapped around camp, though nothing had been disturbed inside his tent. He dismissed it, but mentioned the feeling of being watched. 2 days later, saw lights between the trees, small, bluish, not campfires, moved in a line, then vanished. Could have been reflection, but off what? The entry ended with his usual tally of rations and weather notes, though the handwriting seemed rushed. The last legible passage came on day 7. His neat cursive had grown jagged, letters uneven. Something outside tent last night, circling, breathing. Waited with rifle ready, not sure how long. No tracks this morning. If it comes back tonight, The line trailed off, ink smeared by a streak of moisture, as though he'd closed the journal mid-thought. When searchers later pieced through the campsite, they found the journal tucked beside his sleeping bag, his rifle leaned upright against a nearby spruce, safety off, a round chambered. His pack was still zipped, food untouched, fire pit cold but orderly. It looked less like a man preparing to leave, and more like someone who had stepped outside his own life and never returned. When James failed to return, troopers launched an immediate search. Helicopters scoured the valleys, dogs swept the ridges, and volunteers traced every marked route. They found nothing. No torn clothing, no drag marks, no signs of a fall. After 2 weeks, snow began to choke the terrain, and the search was suspended. His family was left with silence. It wasn't until the following spring, when thaw loosened the ground, that 2 hikers stumbled upon his last camp. The scene unsettled them enough that they hiked out overnight and alerted rangers. The site lay in a clearing near the bend of the river. His tent was pitched neatly, stakes still in place, though the fabric had sagged from months of weather. Inside lay his sleeping bag, a dry box of matches, a tin cup, even a half-finished packet of jerky. Nothing had been torn apart by animals, nothing scattered, nothing that suggested panic. The rifle rested against a spruce, barrel pointed downward, as if he had placed it there intentionally. His backpack leaned nearby, zippers closed, food and ammunition inside. Only the man himself was missing. The journal told the rest. Rangers read the entries in hushed tones, pausing at the final unfinished sentence. They noted how his writing shifted from calm and practical to frantic and uneven, and they lingered on his mention of something circling the tent, the description of breathing outside in the dark. But there were no tracks, no bones, no body, just the camp, eerily preserved, waiting for an owner who never returned. Investigators filed James's disappearance as unresolved. Theories abounded, each one leaving more questions than answers. Some believed he'd been mauled and dragged off by a bear, though the tidy camp argued otherwise. Others suggested he'd wandered delirious into the tundra, lost and overcome by exposure. But his gear was untouched, and he had no reason to leave it behind. What unsettled searchers most was the order of the camp. Hunters in distress often leave chaos, torn shelters, scattered supplies. James's camp looked deliberate, frozen in time. Only his absence and the final words in his journal hinted at panic. Locals added their own whispers, strange vanishings in that valley, stories of hunters hearing voices or finding camps abandoned just so. Whether James became another cautionary tale of Alaska's unforgiving wilderness or something stranger, no one could say. His journal remains locked in evidence, the last line trailing off mid-thought, a silence more chilling than any answer.
The Patterson family had been camping for years, but this was their first trip to a remote stretch of the Umpqua River in Oregon. They chose it because it was quiet. No crowds, just a winding current, thick woods, and a few worn fishing spots known only to locals. For 2 days, it was everything they'd hoped for. Emily, 15, alternated between sketching in her notebook and wading in the shallows with her father. Her mother cooked over the fire, the scent of roasted marshmallows clinging to their clothes. At night, they lay under the canopy of stars, listening to the rush of water and the steady hum of crickets. On the second afternoon, as her parents cleaned up lunch, Emily grabbed a small bucket and announced she was heading down to the riverbank to collect water. It wasn't far, just 50 yards through the trees. Her parents expected her back within minutes. But when 10 passed, then 20, the silence along the river grew heavy. Emily never returned. At first, the Pattersons thought Emily had lingered to sketch or collect stones along the riverbed. But when they walked down the narrow trail, calling her name, only the rush of water answered. Near the bank, they found her shoes placed neatly on a flat rock, her jacket folded beside them. The bucket sat a few feet away, empty. There were no signs of a fall, no scuff marks, no footprints leading into the water. It was as if she had stepped out of her belongings and vanished. Panic set in. They scoured both directions of the river, shouting until their voices broke. By nightfall, rangers and volunteers had arrived. Boats combed the river with floodlights. Dogs picked up Emily's scent, but followed it upstream, strangely, against the current, for nearly 2 miles before it ended without explanation. Searchers marked the spot, puzzled. The bank there showed no sign of entry, only smooth stones and wet moss. The scent simply stopped. Over the following days, dozens of volunteers joined. They dragged nets through the current, checked every snag and bend, crawled over logs and underbrush. Nothing turned up. Some of the search teams returned unsettled. More than one claimed to hear faint singing at dusk, high, lilting, like a girl's voice rising just above the river's rush. They swore it seemed close, but when they stopped to listen, it drifted farther away, always out of reach. No one could say if it was their imagination, exhaustion, or something else carried by the current. The official explanation was that Emily had slipped into the river unseen, carried away in the current. But her parents couldn't accept it. The water near camp was shallow, calm enough to wade in, and no drag marks disturbed the bank. Even if she had been swept downstream, weeks of dragging nets, sonar, and divers should have recovered her. They found nothing. The details that didn't fit weighed heavily on investigators. Her shoes and jacket were dry, folded with care. The dogs following her scent upstream baffled even the most seasoned trackers. Scent trails didn't run against rushing water, not for that distance. It was as though she had walked along the bank and simply ceased to exist. In the weeks that followed, other campers reported strange experiences near that same stretch of river. A father fishing at dusk claimed he heard a girl humming behind him, only to find the bank empty. A couple camping upriver said they were woken in the night by singing, soft, wordless, carried on the breeze. They left before sunrise, too shaken to stay. The Pattersons never returned. Their campsite, once filled with laughter and the smell of marshmallows, was abandoned, gear packed away without a word. Friends said they could no longer bear to hear moving water at night. The case remains unsolved, filed among dozens of wilderness disappearances where answers never surface. But rangers who worked that stretch of river still speak of it in low voices, not about the lost girl herself, but about the sound of singing, how it seemed to ride the current, following them long after the search was over.
David Morales had always been drawn to places most people avoided. At 32, he'd hiked rainforests in Costa Rica, icy trails in the Rockies, and even soloed sections of the Appalachian Trail. But it was the desert that pulled him back again and again. Something about the silence, the unbroken horizons, the way the wind shaped the stone until it looked almost alive. In late May, he set out for a 5-day trek through a remote stretch of Utah Canyon country. The land was a maze of red sandstone mesas, narrow slot canyons that funneled the wind like whispers, and dry washes that could flood without warning. It wasn't a route most chose, but David wasn't reckless. He had marked his course carefully, left copies of his itinerary with friends, and stashed water caches along his intended path. His GPS unit hung from his pack strap, a backup map folded in a waterproof sleeve. Still, when he stopped in the small town nearest his trailhead, the man at the gas station raised an eyebrow. "Heading into those canyons this time of year?" he asked. "Heat plays tricks on you out there. Trails disappear, and sometimes so do the people." David smiled politely, brushing it off as local superstition. He'd heard similar warnings before, often half-rooted in truth. Cautionary tales meant to scare off the unprepared. He wasn't one of those. He carried extra water, checked his compass at every major turn, and kept his journal close at hand, a habit from years of hiking. By the first evening, he had pitched camp against a sandstone wall, the desert cooling rapidly as the sun fell. He wrote in his journal that the stars looked sharp enough to cut, the Milky Way arcing brilliantly above the silent canyons. It was exactly the solitude he'd been craving. He didn't know then that his notes would be the last trace of his journey, fragments of a mystery that rescuers would still argue about years later. By the third morning, David's tone in his journal began to shift. The first 2 entries had been upbeat, filled with descriptions of crimson cliffs glowing in sunrise light and the strange silence of the canyons. But the next note, scrawled hastily across the page, read different. "Hotter than forecast. Feels like the sun is pressing into my skull. Thought I heard someone calling. Just wind, probably. Echoes here are strange.
Sound bounces in ways I can't map. That evening, he reached a slot canyon so narrow he had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The walls rose 40 feet overhead, blocking most of the sky. On one sheer wall, faint carvings stopped him in his tracks. They weren't listed on his map or in any guide he'd studied. He copied them into his journal. Stick-like figures with hollow circles for eyes, arms outstretched. Some appeared to be walking into a spiral shape. Others seemed to vanish halfway through, lines unfinished. His note beneath the sketch read, "Petroglyphs? Not like any I've seen. Why aren't these marked?" Later that night, camped near a dry wash, he wrote of unease. "Keep hearing footsteps, not animals, too even. Every time I shine my light, nothing's there. Maybe I'm overtired, need to rest." Searchers who later recovered the journal would linger on those lines. The writing had grown uneven, pressed deeper into the paper, as though he'd been gripping the pen harder. In his final entry from that day, he added one more detail. "Dreamed I was walking a trail that split in two, but both ended at the same cliff. Woke up with sand in my mouth, like I'd been out there already." His supplies were still in order. He hadn't run out of water. His compass and GPS were functioning, yet something in his words carried the weight of someone already beginning to doubt what was solid beneath his feet.
The final GPS pings from David's tracker placed him on a plateau of fractured sandstone, miles from the nearest road. The device recorded him moving steadily throughout the morning, then stopping around noon. After that, no further signal was ever logged. When search teams began their work days later, they found a trail that seemed at first reassuring. Boot prints led up toward the plateau, pressed into soft red dust. But then the tracks ended abruptly at the base of a sheer rock face, as though he had walked straight into stone. There were no prints leading away. Hours into the search, a ranger spotted something impossible. David's backpack rested on a narrow ledge halfway up the cliff, far above where any hiker could have placed it without ropes. Inside, his food was untouched, water bottles still full. His map and compass were neatly packed. Elsewhere, items turned up scattered in ways that defied explanation. His flashlight lay at the mouth of a canyon several miles away, batteries still working. His wide-brimmed hat was discovered near a dry gulch even farther, folded as though placed intentionally on a rock. None of the finds connected in any logical path. The journal was retrieved from the main pack. The final entry dated the day before his GPS cut out. The handwriting was jagged, uneven. "I keep circling back. Canyon walls looked the same. Heard voices again last night, low, like two people speaking just out of earshot. This morning, I found the markings again. But I was miles away. How? If I follow the path again, will it let me out?" The last line bled off the page, pen scoring deep into the paper, as if he had pressed too hard. Rescuers spent weeks combing the canyons with helicopters, drones, and dogs. No body was ever found.
No new prints, no sign of a fall, no evidence of dehydration or heat stroke. Nothing. Just belongings placed like breadcrumbs across the desert, each one stranger than the last. One ranger later remarked, "It looked less like a man getting lost, more like the desert itself was moving the pieces around, showing us it could take someone whole." The official report listed David Morales as missing, presumed deceased. But the details never sat right with those who searched for him. A fall should have left evidence. Heat stroke should have left his pack torn open, his water drained, his gear scattered in desperation. Instead, everything was orderly, belongings appearing in places no one could explain. Some experts argued he may have suffered hallucinations from dehydration and wandered in circles until the desert claimed him. But his supplies proved otherwise. Water untouched, food intact. Others suggested he had staged his disappearance, though leaving his journal and GPS behind made little sense. The petroglyphs remained the most haunting piece. Several rescuers went back to mark the site, but none could ever find the wall he had sketched. Guides familiar with the region insisted such carvings existed no there. To this day, David's case is filed among dozens of baffling desert vanishings. Each year, a few hikers pause on those same trails, staring up at the ledges where his pack was found, wondering how it got there. And sometimes, when the wind funnels through the canyons just right, it sounds less like air and more like voices, echoes calling from somewhere no map can lead.
The boundary waters of northern Minnesota stretch for more than 1 million acres. Lakes, rivers, and blind forests stitched together in a maze of water and rock. It's a place where silence feels heavier than sound, where a single paddle stroke can echo for what seems like miles. 4 friends set out there one summer, their canoes heavy with gear and spirits high. For 3 days, they traveled deep into the wilderness, navigating narrow channels and camping on granite outcroppings beneath vast northern skies. The air smelled of pine and smoke from their small fires. Loons called across the lakes at dusk, and wolves howled faintly from far ridges. On the 4th morning, Ryan, the strongest paddler of the group, volunteered to scout ahead. A narrow channel split the lake in 2, and he offered to check if it was navigable before the rest carried their heavy canoes. His friends watched him paddle off, his strokes steady, the bow of his canoe vanishing between walls of spruce. He promised to meet them on the other side in half an hour. But when the group reached the channel's mouth, Ryan was gone. Only his canoe floated silently in the rippling water. At first, the friends thought Ryan might be playing a prank. His canoe drifted gently near the reeds, no sign of a capsize, no gear missing. His pack lay inside, zipped, food still stowed neatly. The only thing gone was the paddle. They called his name, voices carrying across the still water. No answer came, only the lonely echo against the tree line. One of them waded to the canoe and pulled it to shore. The hull was dry, unscratched, the pack and life jacket arranged as if Ryan had stepped out calmly and set them down. Yet the mud along the bank was untouched. No footprints leading into the forest, no drag marks, nothing. By late afternoon, panic replaced disbelief. They flagged down another paddler on the lake and hurried back to the nearest ranger station. Within hours, a search party mobilized. Canoes fanned out across the water. Volunteers combed the shorelines with lanterns, and dogs were ferried in by boat to track scent. The results were baffling. The dogs sniffed Ryan's pack, but lost the trail within yards. Searchers scoured the surrounding forest, checking every inlet, every hidden bay. Nothing. On the second night, a pair of rangers reported something odd. While circling the lake by canoe, they saw movement on the shore, dark shapes gliding silently between the trees. At first, they assumed it was other searchers, but when they called out, no voices answered. Their lanterns only reached empty shoreline. The boundary waters grew quieter after that. Every ripple, every creak of a branch carried a weight that made even seasoned rangers uneasy. Ryan had vanished without sound, leaving only his canoe like a question mark on the water. The search stretched for nearly 2 weeks. Helicopters swept low over the lakes, divers probed the cold depths, and volunteers paddled mile after mile through twisting channels. Not a trace of Ryan was ever found. No body, no paddle, no clothing washed ashore. His canoe, returned to his family, was the only thing recovered. Locals shook their heads at the story, saying it wasn't the first time. They spoke quietly of the silent ones, figures said to move along the edges of the lakes, appearing just beyond the reach of campfire light. Whether legend or memory of past vanishings, no one seemed surprised another life had been added to the list. For Ryan's friends, the boundary waters became a place they could no longer bear to think about. They never returned, haunted by the sight of his empty canoe drifting on still water. His case remains unsolved, filed alongside other disappearances in that vast wilderness. To this day, paddlers sometimes claim that when the fog drifts low across the lakes, they hear the faint dip of a paddle somewhere nearby, steady, measured, but belonging to no one they can see.